Lil Durk remains in a federal detention center in Los Angeles following his October arrest. His defense team is now seeking to have the case dismissed, or, at the very least, to secure his release from custody while awaiting trial. They are criticizing federal prosecutors, accusing them of misleading the grand jury by presenting what they claim is false evidence in the rapper's murder-for-hire case.
I'm Elizabeth Manno with Law Enforcement. So what is the false evidence the defense is talking about? Well, they claim it's song lyrics the government painted to the grand jury as Will Lil Durk celebrating and profiting off of revenge murder he alleged ordered. However, the defense says that's not true at all, claiming artists shouldn't be criminalized for lyrical creativity, especially when the song was written months before the murder.
Lil Durk is still being held at a federal detention center in Los Angeles after his arrest in October. His defense team is pushing to have the case thrown out, or, at the very least, to get him released while he awaits trial. They're accusing federal prosecutors of misleading the grand jury by introducing what they say is false evidence in the rapper's murder-for-hire case. Lil Durk remains in federal custody in Los Angeles following his October arrest. And now his defense team is moving to have the case dismissed or, at the very least, secure his release pending trial. The defense claims prosecutors misled the grand jury by presenting false evidence, particularly related to a song tied to the case. According to the defense, the song in question was actually by rapper Babyface Ray, with Lil Durk only featured on the track. They argue Durk had no control over the song's commercialization and point out that he recorded his verse in January 2020, 7 months before Quando Rondo and his cousin were shot in August. They say Durk had no further involvement after that, with all subsequent production handled by others and no changes made to his lyrics. The defense argues that the government knew this timeline but still falsely presented it to the grand jury, making it the central element of the superseding. They emphasize this in a motion, stating, "The issue over timing of Mr. Banks's lyrical verse is not inconsequential. The government's misrepresentation of the song Wonderful Wayne forms the foundation of the superseding indictments." Theory of guilt. Federal prosecutors had written that Durk tried to commercialize the killing by referencing it in music, using audio from a news clip where Quando's cousin was killed and someone was heard screaming, "No, no." The defense countered that this allegation wasn't in the original indictment and only appeared in the superseding one, which does charge Lil Durk. They argue that the indictment rests on a false premise and that allowing it to stand undermines the grand jury's protective function. They also requested the court disclose grand jury proceedings if the indictment isn't dismissed. Durk's family backed the defense, stating the government used false evidence and is criminalizing his artistic expression. "Rap is art. We refuse to stay silent as Black artists continue to be targeted for their creativity." In response, prosecutors downplayed the timing of the song and fan-made videos, saying it has no bearing on whether Durk should remain in custody. They argue that Durk tried to flee the U.S. after his co-conspirators were arrested booking flights to Dubai, Switzerland, and Italy, and that he leads a violent organization responsible for an execution-style killing with machine guns at a gas station. They also point to other songs like Rumors with Gucci Mane and an unreleased track, Scoom, where Durk allegedly references murders, claiming the lyrics reflect real-world violence consistent with SR's killing. Prosecutors maintain that Durk isn't being held over lyrics, but because of his alleged role in orchestrating a murder. On May 1st, a second superseding indictment was filed, adding a new charge, stalking resulting in death. Prosecutors insist this indictment contains no references to lyrics, only new charges linked directly to the August 2022 killing. With a court hearing set for next week, the judge will now decide whether the defense's claims are enough to dismiss the case, or if Lil Durk will remain in custody until trial.
The Will Durk case has so many layers. The defense claims it's the lyrics that helped get Will Durk indicted. Federal prosecutors say the Will Durk alleged actions, that being the reason. So let's bring on now a great guest, and that's civil rights and trial attorney Adante Smith. Adante, great to have you on. What's your reaction to the defense and even Will Durk's family claiming that his lyrics are being used against him?
Well, this is a common refrain, or I should say response, to these type of allegations when artists, be it a rapper or be it whoever, the artwork is being used against them to say they engaged in criminal conduct. We do have freedom of speech in this country, although there are some limits to it. And anything you say can and will be held against you for the law. And this is one of those cases that tease that up.
So prosecutors, they say that the lyrics were an issue that was brought up at his original detention hearing. They have nothing to do with why the judge made that ruling to keep him locked up in the trial. And while the defense points specifically to a feature on Wonderful Wayne and Jackie Boy, the feds used another song that references riding through Beverly Hills, choppers, all this other stuff. What's your reaction to those specific songs being called out in the government?
Well, the government is saying, look, these lyrics and the rap songs and rap verses are too eerily, coincidentally similar to what happened in real life. So is this a situation where art mirrors life, or is life mirroring art? The government is saying your art is mirroring your real life, which is a criminal life. Lil Durk is simply saying, look, these are lyrics. It's art. It so happens to generally fit something that really took place in life. That doesn't mean I'm the person or the culprit that did it. And this is going to be the tug of war, essentially the issue that'll be plowed out throughout this case.
And it's interesting that they point to specifically the Jackie Boy song, mainly because that was recorded 7 months before the murder even happened. What's your reaction to just that this song was recorded months prior to the murder, and yet it was specifically pointed out by federal prosecutors in their first superseding indictment? We'll talk about the second.
I was a bit shocked to find out that the song that the government has essentially rested its foundation on, as it relates to the criminal prosecution of Will Durk, is a song that was recorded several months, I believe 7 to 8 months prior to the actual shooting and killing. So what you have here is the government trying to say, look, you made these lyrics, and these lyrics indicate to us that you're responsible for the shooting, or at least you played a role in it. Lil Durk is saying the song came out so far in advance of the actual shooting, I didn't have anything to do with that. It just so happened, once again, a coincidence that these lyrics generally fit what wound up taking place in the future. Of course, the government's response is, maybe you're just rapping about something that you were intended to do before you actually did.
And what do you think that message kind of sends to other rappers? We've seen this in other cases as well too. Young Thug, now we have Lil Durk, and just other rappers who, do have criminal charges brought against them. But it does seem like, federal authorities, especially in this case, they go to podcasting, they go to lyrics and songs, and use that as evidence against these rappers. But in terms of, freedom of speech and freedom of expression, what does that say to rappers to their point, to the rap defense, I should say? They are expressing a lyrical art form. They are talking about their lives, and maybe sometimes there are instances where they're, over-embellishing, or maybe just kind of like chalking it up for more views, for more listeners to come in, that type of thing. But overall, what do you think that message sends to other rappers that, might get caught up in something like this and their art is used against them?
I think when you see these criminal prosecutions based upon artists' rap lyrics, this is a bright, flashing red flag, warning sign, turn around, go the other way. Because if this is simply their artwork and their art form, and they're engaging in freedom of speech, their creativity is not supposed to lead to seeing the inside of a courtroom, handcuffs, and potentially very long prison sentences. So I think that any rapper or any entertainer, period, any artist or creator, has to take note and have a really clear understanding that what they say may and will be used against them in a court of law. And we find them in a lot of hot water if it comes even close to mimicking something that's taking place in real life.
A government on Friday, today I should say, that says Will Durk is facing another charge of stalking, and this is coming after a grand jury handed down a second superseding indictment. Are you surprised there is a second superseding indictment, and what do you make of this stalking charge?
Well, it is in some ways it's surprising to see yet another superseding indictment come down. However, if you understand the way the government works, particularly the federal government, they're not going to stop investigating, and they will essentially pile up all of these charges, roll them into one criminal prosecution and force the defendant to fight their way out of it and defending against a myriad of charges, which makes it exponentially tougher for the defendant to actually get acquitted and declared innocent. Because you have so many battles that you have to fight, you're almost overwhelmed. So while I'm sure Lil Durk was disappointed to hear about it, the question is that really a weak allegation that's being added, or is it something that really does have a solid evidentiary foundation, and therefore he has to be concerned as it adding to whatever his criminal prosecution or sentence may be?
Looking at other federal cases, to your point, including Sean Diddy Combs, who had 3 superseding indictments, but now it seems like Will Durk is almost there with now 2 superseding indictments. And the defense wrote in a court filing that the government provided a copy of the new indictment to undersigned counsel on today's date. In the second superseding indictment, the government has chosen to remove the allegations regarding Mr. Banks' lyrics in the first superseding indictment and remove any allegation regarding the payment of the bounty previously included in the first superseding indictment as well too. What do you make of the defense's response?
Well, I think the defense is doing its job. The defense is pointing out the way in which the indictments have changed, they've morphed over time, and typically what you would expect is more factual allegations, more evidence, the inclusion of additional crimes. What you would not and do not expect is that the government, after the defense made an argument about that song predating the alleged criminal conduct, now, coincidentally or intentionally, the government now deleted or removed those allegations from the indictment. So that actually, to me, is a point scored, if you will, for Lil Durk, and a point taken away, if you will, from the government.
Because yeah, it seems like at first they were doubling down, but now it seems like they're kind of reversing course and just kicking it out altogether. In your opinion, do you think the judge will reconsider the detention order, and do you think it's possible at this stage with Lil Durk that he can actually get bail possible?
I think the judge will take this into consideration. I'd be surprised if Lil Durk's counsel don't make another run at getting the bail reconsidered by the judge. This is certainly could be considered new evidence that the judge did not initially have to consider, especially when you're dealing with bail. The judge is looking at the allegations in the indictment, and if those allegations change or the evidentiary underpinnings of those allegations become weakness, and it's incumbent upon the judge to reevaluate whether or not this is a person, i.e. Lil Durk, can be monitored, supervised outside of being placed in a jail cell while he's fighting this case. So I think this could potentially be a game changer for Lil Durk.
Now, prosecutors, on the other hand, they say that Lil Durk is a danger and a risk of flight. Now, the FBI said that he had booked 3 different flights in 3 different countries. Once he knew his co-conspirators were arrested, and Lil Durk, and he was arrested back in October, was arrested at a Miami airport. In terms of just risk or even risk of flight, do you think that the prosecution has a strong argument there?
Well, there's much ado made about these multiple flights that he had. I've seen it reported that, Lil Durk had these different flights because he was trying to figure out how to get to his destination the most efficient. We don't know if that's true or not, but that was his claim. And I think anytime you're dealing with a high net worth individual, there is that heightened risk that they can use their resources and their network to flee the long arm of the law. However, for someone who's famous as he is, he's not someone like a Kanye or a Diddy that's, everyone kind of knows on the site. But I would think it'd be pretty easy to keep tabs on someone such as Lil Durk. So I think the government and the feds in particular, if they're inclined to want to allow him to be free while he fights this case, they certainly can come up with some accommodations in order to keep tabs.
And I think the defense is even offering up like a $3 million bail package. So it seems like from the defense's angle that they really just kind of want their client to at least be able to fight his case from the outside. So we'll kind of see what happens. But in your opinion, there on the court's calendar, it's possible that Lil Durk will go on trial later this fall in October. But in your opinion, do you think federal prosecutors do actually have enough to convict Lil Durk? Now, they claim that they have phone records, credit card information, financial records that feel like include the killers. What are your thoughts on just kind of the evidence the prosecution?
Well, the prosecution certainly painted a strong case and a picture that seems to firmly place Lil Durk in the center of the shooting. However, we certainly there are many examples of case falling apart on its way to trial, be it by witnesses, be it evidentiary evidence, an investigation was compromised, and then that comes to the light. So while the allegations that the government are making are very serious, that they have done their homework, it doesn't mean that there weren't some missteps or overreach along the way. And those will be the issues that Lil Durk's attorneys will be quick to point out, or will use as a hammer, if you will, in order to try to loosen, or I should say, break the resolve of the government going forward with these criminal charges.
Do you think it's possible that Lil Durk might have a mole in his camp? Do you think it's possible that there was someone along this way the entire time, possibly working as a cooperating witness to the federal government?
Do I think there was a mole? The answer would be yes, in caps, underscore, and bold. Because that is a very common and frequent tactic, in particular the federal government uses. They find someone that is next to or adjacent to the main target, and they find out that they've committed some type of crime, and give them some sort of leniency in exchange for information or access to the main target. So it would actually be surprising to me if there was not a mole or some other confidential informant that was within Durk's camp feeding information to the federal government. Of course, that also opens up the idea of credibility of this said witness or informant, because if they're backwards against the wall and they're facing 300 years, many people, unfortunately, despite what we might think, be quick to tell and throw the friend under the bus. I remember once upon a time I was handling a case, and the defendant told me, "Hey, the police told me, why go to the pen? Pen being short, penitentiary, and you can send it. Why go to the pen? And you can send it print." And so people have all the incentive in the world to throw someone else under the bus in order to save themselves. And that's something that certainly do.
Especially when you have, again, to your point, decades, hundreds of years possibly in a federal penitentiary versus what could be maybe a sweetheart deal in comparison. Yeah, I could see why maybe some people would decide to go that route. And as far as prosecutors, they allege that the motive behind this was Lil Durk orchestrated the shooting in retaliation for King Von's death. They have Quando Rondo allegedly being associated with King Von's killer, that type of thing. But in terms of just the defense strategy, what do you think that could look like, especially as, to your point earlier, just the federal government, when they swing, they don't really miss, and they put a lot of stuff against you, and it can be pretty intimidating. But how do you think the defense could make a comeback?
Well, in a situation, most people who are on against the federal government don't have the type of resources that a very well-selling and famous rapper might have at their beck and call. So I think Lil Durk would put up a very vigorous defense. But as I used to say as an attorney, criminal defense attorney, I'm an attorney, I'm not a magician. So I can't make things appear invisible. What I'm able to do is give different perspectives on items of evidence and or poke holes where there are some weaknesses in the government's case. And, the thing here is that they're able to show, the government, they're able to show that Lil Durk had a motive for the shooting. But it's also still pretty tenuous because they don't have him there at the time of the shooting. They'd have to have more, which is what the government is alleging. Documents, money, transferring hands, orders being given, congratulations being given out on the back end, money being sent. There has to be some other corroborating evidence other than motive to put Lil Durk in the penitentiary for the shooting.
And to your point also, it's just the criminal defense attorney making those little holes that could be enough to sway at least maybe possibly one juror, maybe more. It's not out of the realm of possibility to so many times throughout Law and Crime. Adante Pointer, I want to thank you so much for your insight into this case. Before we sign you off, though, do you think that the judge will reconsider the detention order at next?
I think it will. I think the judge will reconsider the detention order. The question is, I'm not sure if it'll be a next week's hearing. The judge may decide to do it on their own sua sponte, or they may wait, judge attorneys file a formal motion. I'd imagine that motion is being feverishly typed up right now, so that it could be in front of the judge by the time it'll get.
Probably more court documents coming down bright and early Monday morning. I think they try to at least ask for a deadline between Tuesday, so we can see that filing coming down very, very soon. Adante Pointer, thank you so much again for your time and your insight into this case. I really appreciate it.
Always love doing this.
According to online records, Will Lil Durk has another court hearing set for Thursday, May 8th. But for now, he remains in federal custody at NBC Los Angeles. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Miller.